Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June 2024 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we have Matthew Rosencrans from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, who will be discussing the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season. Let's see, are the slides? Hopefully the slides are advancing. There we go. Great, thank you. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. Okay, next slide. All right, so I realize this sounds like a broken record, but temperatures over the past month were once again above average across much of the Southeast, though the anomalies were not as great as what we've seen in prior months. The greatest departures were found across parts of Florida and the Gulf Coast and across the northern tier of the region, with some locations running up to 4 degrees above average. This past weekend, the mercury hit 100 degrees at Washington's Reagan Airport for the first time since August of 2016. Extreme heat continued to plague the Caribbean. In fact, the National Weather Service in San Juan issued excessive heat warnings on 7 consecutive days from June 7th through the 13th, meaning the maximum heat index values were expected to reach 112 degrees on those days. Okay, next slide, please. So after a wet winter and generally wet spring, summer has started off very dry for much of the Southeast, especially across parts of North Florida, parts of Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, where rainfall over the past month has been running less than 25% of normal in places. Several locations have gone multiple weeks without any measurable rain. Of note, Valdosta, Georgia, is going on 28 straight days without any measurable rain. On the other hand, above average rainfall was recorded across interior portions of the region and especially across parts of South Florida, while rainfall over the past month has been variable across the Caribbean. Okay, next slide. Looking more closely at South Florida, much of the rain over the past month fell between the 11th and 13th of June as Invest 90 tracked across the central portion of the peninsula. While the National Hurricane Center was monitoring this area of low pressure for possible development into a tropical cyclone, showers and thunderstorms dropped heavy rain from around Gainesville all the way down to the Keys, prompting the state of Florida as well as other counties and counties and cities in the state to issue a state of emergency. Speaking of Gainesville, over 2.5 inches of rain fell in just 1 hour on the evening of June 11th, tying for the third highest hourly rainfall amount on record since 1943. Also that evening, Sarasota recorded nearly 4 inches of rain in an hour, which actually broke the previous record for greatest hourly rainfall total by nearly a full inch, and that's in a record going back to 1972. The rain connected with Invest 90, which was aided by southerly flow associated with the Bermuda High, resulted in significant flooding in places like Sarasota, Everglades City, and parts of Miami. In all, some locations recorded around a foot of rain from the event. These are amounts not seen since Hurricane Ian back in 2022. Numerous roadways were flooded, inundating vehicles as well as residential and commercial structures, while some motorists required rescue after being stranded in their vehicles. Okay, next slide. So as we've seen before, if we look at the month to date temperature rankings on the left, we see that once again, several stations in Florida are on track to record one of their warmest Junes on record, while several stations across Northern Virginia, including Washington, D.C., are on track to record one of their warmest Junes on record. The same holds true for Puerto Rico, where San Juan is off to its warmest start to the month on record, while data now available on St. Croix shows that it is also off to one of its warmest starts to the month on record. Looking at precipitation there on the right, it's no surprise to see that many locations across the Southeast are on track to record one of their driest Junes on record, while the rainfall from Invest 90 has several locations across South Florida on track to record one of their wettest Junes on record. Okay, next slide. So given the lack of rain and above average temperatures over the past several weeks, abnormal dryness was recently reintroduced across a large portion of the region. Moderate drought also returned to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and in pockets of Georgia and South Carolina. Though not shown here, conditions across parts of South Florida had actually deteriorated a good bit, with severe drought covering a good portion of the citrus belt into early June. But as we can see in the most recent drought monitor, the rains from Invest 90 resulted in 1 to 2 category improvements, with the southern end of the peninsula free of any drought or abnormal dryness, at least for now. Next slide. And looking in the Caribbean, we see the region is still free of any drought or abnormal dryness. Okay, next slide. So we finally bid farewell to El Nino and officially welcomed ENSO neutral conditions to the equatorial Pacific. However, its stay is likely to be short-lived, as La Nina conditions are expected to develop sometime this summer, with a 65% chance of development during the July to September period. This is consistent with last month's forecast, though forecasters have noted that the rate of cooling has slowed somewhat. There's also the expectation that La Nina will persist into the upcoming winter, with an 85% chance during the November to January period. Okay, next slide. So as we look over the next 3 months, we see that above average temperatures are favored across the southeast region, while above average precipitation is favored everywhere except most of Tennessee and extreme western Virginia. Okay, next slide. And if we look in the Caribbean, we see that above average temperatures and precipitation are expected for the rest of the summer and into early fall. All right, next slide. Looking at the seasonal drought outlook, we see that the small pockets of drought dotted across the southern tier of the region are expected to end within the next several months, while areas of moderate drought over Virginia are expected to persist. At least for now, no new development is expected across the region, and this includes the Caribbean as well. Okay, next slide. Looking ahead to next week, above average temperatures are very likely across the entire region, while above average precipitation is expected across the interior and northern portions of the region, as well as much of the Florida Peninsula. Okay, next slide. Looking out to 2 weeks, we see a continuation of above average temperatures. South Florida looks to remain on the wet side, while above average precipitation is likely across most of Virginia and parts of the Carolinas. Okay, next slide. So over the next couple of weeks, the CPC is forecasting the potential for excessive heat across central and eastern portions of Virginia and North Carolina, as well as extreme northern portions of Tennessee. There's also the potential for rapid onset or flash drought to develop from Virginia down to northern portions of Georgia and South Carolina. And Pam will talk about the implications of this in her talk. Okay, next slide. And finally, as we look ahead to next month, we see that above average temperatures, again, are expected across the region, as is above average precipitation, except across Tennessee, which is expected to be drier than normal. Okay, next slide. Lastly, just as a reminder, the Southeast Regional Climate Center helps produce a number of reports on the state of the climate in the region. These include our monthly and quarterly reports, and they provide much more detail than what we're able to cover in these webinars. So if you'd like more information on recent climate conditions in the region, please check out our products, as well as those from some of our regional partners. They're located under the Climate Monitoring tab on our homepage at sercc.com. And of course, if you have questions or would like to provide feedback on these products, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, and here's a summary for you to look over after the webinar. Happy to answer questions at the end. I also want to acknowledge our service climatologist, William Schmitz, who helped compile much of this information. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, Chris. So we can go ahead and go to our next slide so that we can move on. And my briefing is going to follow along very closely with what Chris has been talking about, and kind of how things are shifting now. Over the last month, one of the, a lot of times when we have a wet May, which in a lot of the Southeast we were pretty wet. A lot of times that we will tend to stay wet in June as we get kind of a feedback loop, where we'll get pop-up thunderstorms and everything else. But early in the month, we had a front push through that pushed a lot of that moisture to the south, and you saw all that rainfall in Florida. So a lot of South Florida, which had been in drought, increased that. It helped improve conditions in South Florida, but also we got a lot of flooding. But we didn't see, but we also lost a lot of that moisture. And so we're really not seeing that right now. And so we look at the 28-day average stream flows typically, and I went ahead and continued to do that. But so you can see that over much of the Southeast, where we show normal, but we're starting to show some hints of dryness, and you'll see that on the left-hand screen with the browns and starting to get a few of the reds somewhere in there. As if we looked at more short-term conditions, we would likely see that those are really starting to turn very quickly, and that the stream flows are starting to turn. And if you look at the right-hand graphic, which shows it's a duration hydrograph that kind of looks over the past couple of years, you can see that last month when we did this call, everything was improving. We were starting to get more into normal. We were actually looking into above normal, but just in the last month, how quickly we have dropped from normal to almost below, or above normal to almost below normal as we've gotten into June. And that's just an overview of the whole Southeast. So let's move to the next slide and look at each of the different different states, and you'll see a very similar pattern as we look at these. As you look at Alabama on the left-hand side, you can see that it has fallen very quickly and it was in good shape. The same with Georgia. It was also almost well above normal at that point. We had some pretty good flooding in parts of Georgia during May, and now we're back into the normal, but dropping very quickly again, as some areas have because of the heat and because of the lack of rain, have really caused some problems in the Southeast. And the same for Florida. But we always talk about Florida a little bit differently. We stay in the normal range in there because they're quite different. The south half of Florida got a significant amount of rain, while the north half of Florida and the Panhandle was well below normal. So you get a mix in that state, which makes it a little bit more difficult. And as the Central Florida and South Florida starts to move into their wet season, which is why we've which is part of the, at least part of the reason they've started to see all that rainfall. We have a very diverse state at that point. So let's go ahead and move a little bit further north with the next slide as we get to South Carolina. And South Carolina and North Carolina, you can see they've followed the same pattern also, but they're actually getting to below normal. They've been warm, as was mentioned in Washington, D.C., and that whole eastern seaboard has stayed really dry. So a lot of those gauge stations in those areas have dried out very quickly and are already below normal. As last month we were seeing, they were almost above normal in last months. So I think this is, as we've talked about in the last few years, and flash drought has become something to talk about. These are the kinds of things we see when we're getting into a flash drought. We have hot weather. And we have very little rainfall, and things deteriorate very quickly. And the last one is Virginia, and it is also below normal. So we end up being below normal along all that eastern seaboard. And now with the potential for not getting much rain and continued heat, we could see those conditions continue to deteriorate as we go forward. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. While we had a significant amount of rain in South Florida, most of them didn't hit the basins that we have. We had one hit one of ours at Palmdale, Fishing Creek, but even because it had been so dry, we didn't see any significant flooding in those areas. And as for the rest of the Southeast, it is Lake Okeechobee has also dropped below their action stage. So we do not have anything in flood right now, which we've started to try and look when the last time we did not have anything in action stage or flood stage, and I'm thinking it's been a couple of years. So, but we're trying to dig into that and find out when that's happened. It's been rare, and so we're switching our gears from flooding, which we've had numerous over the last couple of years, to a drought and drought issues that we may have to start addressing going forward. So let's go ahead and move ahead to the next slide. We are in week 26, and for the most part, this is typically a quiet time of year in the Southeast for the rivers. We can have flooding during this time of year, but it's not one where we would expect flooding, or that climatologically we would see a whole lot of flooding. And we also, the other side of that is that this is the time of year, even when we get normal rains, our rivers start to get a little bit lower. Our reservoirs start to fall a little, just because the competition for the water with evapotranspiration and evaporation out of the lakes and out of the ground is higher than our normal rainfall totals. So we would expect things to start drying out some, but they've been drying out more than they normally would, mostly because of the heat and because of not getting as much rainfall. So while we're not getting any flooding, we are starting to dry out. So this is the most of the southeast. Let's go ahead and look at the central and south Florida graphic. And this is the time when we expect them to start to really pick up their wet season, with tropical weather and just a general wet climate during that time. This is when we expect most of their flooding down in central and south Florida. Now, obviously our most recent rainfall, there was flash flooding, but the river flooding did not materialize just because the rainfall stayed south of the basins that we make forecasts for. And it did just bring us kind of out of drought, because we did have some heavy rains in some areas where we do have river gauges and places we forecast, but it was so dry that a lot of that just soaked into the ground and didn't get to those river points. So while we've improved down there, we still have a lot of improvement over much of the rest of Florida. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So right now, because we had rain last month, because we're kind of in this transition time, we're still looking for normal risk of flooding. It was mentioned before that over the next 3 months, we're expecting above normal rainfall over these next 3 months. I think a lot of that has to do with the potential for tropical season being active, that we will get a lot of tropical moisture, that the tropical season will bring rain to the southeast. But that's you always have to be careful with that, because if we can get lots of storms, and Matthew will talk about this, I'm sure, in just a little bit, but we might not end up with them in the south. Maybe they end up in Texas, or they end up in Mexico, or they end up staying out into the ocean. So it's part of our climatology, and we need that rainfall from those storms. If they don't end up hitting our area, then we might end up being normal or below normal, which would change our future forecast. It would mean that we might get into drought more quickly. So I say normal because there is still that chance for above normal rainfall. And if we do see storms move into the area, then those are the types of conditions we're going to see. However, if we don't see those storms develop, then we'll be below normal. So we're keeping it kind of in that normal range and working forward with that. So we'll go ahead and go to my summary slide, and that's all I have. So I will be on if there are questions a little bit later, and now we'll pass it on to Pam.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Todd. It's been an interesting spring, hasn't it? So here, let's jump right into the recent conditions on agriculture. Last month, I was talking about how wet it was, and this month, it's mostly the dry conditions that have caused a lot of problems for farmers. Many dry conditions, there's diseases associated with that, like aspergillus, stem rot, and so those are the kind of things that people really need to watch for now. Because it's been so dry and hot, some of the plants are really not responding very well. They like temperatures a little bit more moderate, and that may delay the maturity, which means it's going to push harvest later into the fall. I don't know what that's going to do yet with the tropical season this year, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. I was amused by this quote from Scott Graham in Alabama. Temperatures are stressing crops, plants, animals, and cotton agronomists. And I think probably if I polled all of you, you'd probably feel about the same way. It's been very hot. I was up in DC this weekend. It got to 101 on Saturday, I think. But of course, the convention halls were about 66 degrees, so I managed to catch a cold from the change in temperature between inside and outside. Heavy rain in Florida and the south part, wiped out the drought, caused some delays in field work, but the areas just to the north and the citrus belt are still pretty dry. And so they've been irrigating like crazy, as many people have in the southeast. Irrigated crops are requiring a lot of water, but they're generally doing okay as long as they have enough water to keep them going. Dryland crops are in much worse shape, and so it's, I mean, some places probably have seen the dryland crops just fail because if they really have a lot of water needs and they're not getting any at all, with this heat, they're just not going to be able to do well. Hay production was doing well. The first cutting of hay was generally pretty good. It dried off because of the heat. But because it's been so dry, the pastures haven't regenerated and farmers are starting to have to feed their cattle again. And so that's a concern going into later in the year. Peach and blueberry harvests are still going, but they're nearly done, depending on the varieties. Watermelons, you know, they put those out. They want to get them out in the market for the 4th of July holiday. A few people have commented on incredible yields with some of these crops this year. So it's been really good for them. And that's great after last year's really bad hit from the frost. They've seen southern corn rust in several Georgia counties. That blows in from the south and west. So we always try to look at wind roses to see what the wind direction has been over time. And one bright note, I guess, is that dry conditions have led to many days available for field work compared to last year, where about half the days you couldn't get out in the fields. Problem is, it's so dry that you can't really put on a lot of the fungicides and so on because they need some moisture to work with. So let's go on. Soil temperature and moisture. The temperatures on the left here, you can see temperatures of the surface soils are generally warmer than usual. That's not surprising because when soils are dry, as you see on the right, all the heat from the sun goes into heating up the soil temperatures. And so that has been a continuing condition. The only place that hasn't been hot is South Florida, where it was so wet. And that has slowed down the soil temperatures a bit. So if we go on. Chris mentioned the flash drought. This is an old map. I think if you looked at this today using that link there, it probably has expanded quite a bit to most of Georgia and a lot of the other southeast. Rapid onset drought is driven partly by temperature and partly by dry spells. And we've had a lot of both. And so the flash drought potential is very high for most of the region. That means if you've got sensitive plants, for example, if you've got corn that's sulking and you're a dryland farmer, that's going to be a huge issue. And so people are going to have to increase their irrigation if they have it, and they're going to have some problems otherwise. And I will say here, I don't have a map of the condition monitoring reports, but I've noticed there's been a lot of them from the southeast, especially from Georgia, and I am really proud of you guys for putting those in. I'll put a link to that in the chat so you can take a look at it. I'm not going to do it while I'm talking because otherwise I'll forget what I'm doing. But anyway, great job. Keep up the condition monitoring reports. They're really helpful for us to determine exactly what's going on where you live. So let's go on. All right, the dry conditions. This is just the map that shows the last 30 days. Percent of normal precipitation. You can see a huge amount of the southeast is less than 50% of normal precipitation. That does allow the field work, but it means there's no rain, and so we're having a lot of water stress because of that. If we go on, growing degree days across most areas have been pretty close to the long-term average, well above last year. And you can monitor these at agroclimate just to see how things are compared to last year if you like to do that. But they're doing fine right now. We'll just have to see. Maybe if the heat continues, it will rise up above the long-term historic average. If we go to the next slide, here's my summary. I'll let you read it at your leisure. And now it's my real pleasure to introduce Matt Rosenkrantz, who's going to speak to us about this year's tropical hurricane outlook. And I know you're all looking forward to this, and so am I. So take it away, Matt.
All right, everyone. Good morning. So yeah, I'm Matt Rosenkrantz, and I'll talk about the 2024 seasonal hurricane outlook. Want to remind everyone that the Atlantic Basin hurricane season, if you look on the right side of the slide here, it does start on the 1st of June. So we are 25 days into it. We have had one tropical storm, Alberto, that did make landfall in northern Mexico, but spread a lot of rain into southern Texas. So just that is our reminder for the year that tropical storm impacts can happen very far away from the center of circulation. So another thing, just so again, the 30th there, 30 June, We do issue the initial outlook in May, and we will update the outlook in early August. Next slide. The reason we update in early August, as you can see here on the left-hand side, is because that is still before the peak of the hurricane season. The peak of the Atlantic hurricane season is August, September, October. That compromises about 90% of your tropical storm activity. 75% of your tropical storm and hurricane activity in the Atlantic happens after August 20th. So we do take that time in early August to update and get the latest information out to you. We do not update the East Pacific. Some recurving moisture from those systems and recurving disturbances can end up in the Southeast, but that's very late in the year and usually after end of September, early October if that happens. That's quite rare. Next slide. Just to remind everyone, so in July we do get some formations in the Gulf. They're still kind of rare. In 100 years, you know, there's a 10 to 30% chance in any given month that you would have a formation, or in July in a year, so it's 10 to 29%. If you look at that on the east coast of Florida, that's about the same. But once you get into August, you end up with a 30 to 50% chance of having a formation in the Gulf of Mexico, with the higher odds off of the east coast of the U.S. Off the east coast of Florida and the Gulf Stream there, with some of that moisture and impacts curving back in towards the Carolinas. So something to keep a watch on. But the real peak month, September, peak of the hurricane season, September 10th. And then you have really good odds of having formations that kind of come up, can have impacts into the Southeast. In October, you still have some decent odds, and that kind of shifts back from the kind of main development region down the big tropical Atlantic, kind of shifts back towards the Southeast U.S. You can get some frontal boundaries that come down, and you can get some formations along them. So that's why there's kind of a secondary peak up towards the Gulf of Mexico and off the east coast of Florida later in the year. Not shown here is November. Typically, we end up with about a storm formation every other November. And I'll get into a little bit of details about that later in this briefing about what we expect this year. Next slide. Climatology, when you look at this at different points in different counties along the coastline, the average hurricane return period, 5 to 7 years, and anywhere in red, anywhere in orange here is 8 to 11 years. So most of the Southeast is, you know, between that 5 to 12 years. There's some that are 13 there. In some of the concave bays, although, you know, last year there was a storm that moved into the, you know, Big Bend of Florida, Idalia. So some of these are not immune from the activity. It's just less common there. Next slide. So our outlook for this year, the Atlantic, 17 to 25 named storms. That is quite a bit above normal. Normal is 14 for the named storms. So we are expecting an active hurricane season, 8 to 13 hurricanes, 4 to 7 major hurricanes. To remind everyone, major hurricanes have winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. Saffir-Simpson scale would be a category 3 or higher for a major hurricane. For reference, this is our highest range of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes that we have forecast. The highest number of named storms in a season is 30. The highest number of hurricanes is 15, and the highest number of major hurricanes is 7. So we are not forecasting any new records this year compared to observations, but these are our highest ranges forecast. It is the second highest forecast for the range of accumulated cyclone energy, which is our measure of total energy on the entire season. And I can get into the calculation for that if somebody wants to talk about that later. Those numbers being high does result in an 85% chance of an above normal season when we turn this back into probabilities. Next slide. So just looking at this, oh, this did not translate to PowerPoint very well. Or something didn't translate well. Again, 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 hurricanes, and 4 to 7 major hurricanes. That's the leftmost column there. The May 2023 column running down the middle there. And the green checks are just where the outlook last year then verified. So we were just a little bit low in the number of named storms, but the number of hurricanes, major hurricanes, and the accumulated cyclone energy all came in as forecast. When we updated in August, we upped the number of named storms quite a bit because we had some early season activity last year. Ended up with 20 named storms. So the forecast, all 4 categories verified properly in August. Next slide. Putting this year's context in historical, or putting this year's outlook in context, that 150 to 245% of normal, that would mostly be above the hyperactive threshold, which is 165% of normal, represented by the red bar, the red horizontal bar on this chart. The black horizontal bar is the threshold for an above normal season. So our range here represents 70% of the outcome. And that the bottom of that bar is still above the above normal threshold. So that's why we're at an 85% chance of above normal threshold. So this would be one of our busier seasons. If we hit the upper end of this forecast range, it would be the 3rd busiest season on record. Depending on the exact calculation, could be the 2nd busiest season on record. Have to go back and look, and a lot of times there's past years where the data is reanalyzed, new data is found, and it changes some of those prior values. So I recalculate these every year. So these lines have tiny little wiggles to them. So I'd have to say, I can't say exactly whether it be the 2nd or the 3rd highest if we hit the exact 245% of normal. But it would be up there, you know, in the top 5%. We're likely to be on the top 5 of the busiest seasons if we get into the good middle part of our distribution, our forecast. Next slide. Why do we care about that activity? Besides just the number of storms and the science behind it, right? So these systems, the more systems are out there, the more they can impact shipping, and if they stay out over the water, shipping, fishing, maritime industries, and that has a large impact into the economy of the Southeast. If they get closer and they make landfalls, we do notice a big statistical difference in active seasons and hurricane landfalls along the Atlantic coast. Those double in odds during these active seasons. The Gulf Coast does not have that quite a change. It's got a higher number of landfalls during busier seasons, which makes sense. And that number is about what you would expect just from a pure change in there's more storms, so we're going to have more landfalls, that 25% increase. But a lot of times the wind patterns and the overall circulation patterns that are associated with these busy seasons also can drive more storms in the western half of the basin. So you can have those increased activity that does happen and gets you to landfalls on the Atlantic coastline. So that's the bigger change and the bigger signal there. Busy seasons also, you are more likely to see multiple landfalls, and you are more likely to see multiple landfalls in the same area, because a lot of times these climate patterns will set up and be there for a month or 2. So you will see repeated tracks in the same area. And that can be particularly devastating. 2020, it happened in Southwest Louisiana, and the Lake Charles area was decimated. So we really want people to prepare now for that season so you can recover from a storm as quickly as possible, rather than being threatened by the second storm coming in, and that can really do a lot more damage to already weakened structures, already weakened communities. Next slide. Next slide. So this is the graphic about what we're looking at for this season. We are expecting the ongoing high activity area conditions, which means warm sea surface temperatures, below average wind shear, and weak trade winds, and a stronger West African monsoon. All of those things point to a busy season. On top of that, we are, as was mentioned already, going into a La Niña. La Niñas are associated with more tropical storms in the Atlantic because they also help to reduce the wind shear. They also help to create they decrease the stability in the atmosphere, so you can have more rising motions over the Atlantic, which means more storm formations, thunderstorm formations. Clusters of thunderstorms then become tropical depressions, which then become tropical storms when they don't have something kind of pushing down on them from above. So next slide. Just going into some of the details behind this, we have well above normal sea surface temperatures in the main development region of the Atlantic. Those on a weekly basis are above normal. They have been above normal this entire year. except for 2 weeks during the first part of June. But the main development region in the Atlantic and the overall North Atlantic has actually been record warm since the beginning of this year, really since the middle of last year at the same time. It started to be record warm, and then that went on for a year, and it continued all the way until the first part of June this year, when this year was finally cooler than last year, only on a 1 week average. But then the latest 2 weeks, we are back warmer than we were last year. So we are looking at current temperatures in the Atlantic that are on par with those during September, and even during middle to later part of September. And just for reference, the ocean changes slower than the atmosphere. So the warmest time of year in the North Atlantic is actually the third week of September. So that's quite a bit delayed. So we are currently now in June looking at temperatures that are on par with the hottest time of the year. So that would be looking at, July temperatures in March. If you're drawing an analog to temperatures over the land, temperatures over the water just take longer times, but we're about 3 months ahead of schedule where we should be for the ocean. And then we can see in the Pacific with the blue box there, we are seeing some cool temperatures kind of creeping into the central Atlantic. We have ENSO neutral declared in early June, so you can see a mix of cool and warm in the central Pacific, and those are likely to become cooler. Next slide. Yep. So then those are likely to become cooler as we keep going on. So this is the latest weekly values. We are still in a Niño 3-4 value that is a 0.3. So it's still looking a little bit warm, but it has, you can see on the right hand side here, second plot from the bottom, it has increased. I think I actually have that value wrong. I need to go look at that. And I think I don't have that right. That value is taking a long time to come up my screen. I'm not sure that that value is right. I am opening that to check that. I think that's a minus 0.3 because this looks like a minus down here on the Niño 3-4. So I'm opening that right now. Nope, says Niño 3-4 is a 0.3. Okay. And then we're seeing the Niño 3, that's the below. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong plot. So the Niño 3-4, that's cold. And you can kind of see that in the plot up here where it's got this decent cold pool right here, right around 120 west. But then as you move to the west, which Niño 3-4 is a little bit further west, you actually get into, it starts to clip a bit of the warm temperatures that come back towards the equator. And also out to 170 west, so you get some above normal temperatures still in the Central Pacific. So that can explain why we're seeing some variation in the Niño 3-4 region, which is the official measurement that we use for declaring El Niños and La Niñas. That's what NOAA uses. We are also seeing some reduced cloudiness over the Central Pacific, which shows, and increased cloudiness over the Western Pacific and Southeast. So that really does show that we are heading into that La Nina, because that's a La Nina pattern that you would expect. Next slide. Again, 75% chance of being in a La Nina during August, September, October. And that's just really supportive of more tropical storms and hurricanes, mainly because it reduces wind shear over the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And then also because it reduces stability, increases instability, both the same, across most of the Atlantic. It makes it more favorable for storms to form over the Atlantic in a vertical sense. Next slide. And then we also look at the West African monsoon and the trade winds. Left-hand side, the trade winds, you can see that we have westerly wind anomalies across a lot of the Western Atlantic and even portions of the main development region. That green box shifted when these slides were translated. I'm sorry about that, but that should be a little further south and east. But that westerly wind anomaly in the kind of orange there right around northeast of Cuba, that is, and then there's also one more out in the main development region right around 40 west, 10 north. It's indicative of weakened trade winds, and that can help reduce wind shear. We're looking at also on the right hand side here, the West African monsoon. That was below normal. There was a lot of oranges representing drought, sinking air and dry conditions over that area. In the last 2 weeks, that has come back to being more near normal. And it's been near normal over the past 45 days. So this is the fact that it's come back to near normal in this period means we may see some days above normal in the next couple of days because it was below normal earlier part of the year. So next slide. And the future of the West African monsoon, we are expecting an above normal and wet West African monsoon, which makes the waves that come off of Africa stronger. And then those are more likely to develop into hurricanes a little bit further out into the Atlantic and to give you more activity overall. Oh, next slide. That's fine. One of the other things we did look at too, the wind shear. So in this plot, generally blue is conducive to tropical storm and hurricane formation. Orange will hamper tropical storm and hurricane formation. And if we look at these models, there's a lot of blue in the main development region and also in the western parts of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of the storms form that would have a higher chance of making landfall in the southeast. So once they form in that main development region, kind of south of Cuba, that's one of the more likely formation regions that have tracks that go into the southeast US. Some of these wind shear values are quite low, and the one on the right here, the minus 1.99, that was in the 29th percentile of our hurricanes, of our events, about the history of this, and these models go back to 1991. We use a 30-year period of looking at those, so it's well below normal in that shear value. Next slide. So my takeaway, again, we are looking at above normal season with 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 hurricanes, and 4 to 7 major hurricanes. There's a lot of really good websites on here on how to prepare before the season, which we are in the season now, but it's been quiet so far. And then when it becomes time for hurricane season, through one does threaten, hurricanes.gov or weather.gov in your local forecast office will be really good sources of information. That's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing this important information. And also thank you to Todd and Pam for your presentations as well. I do want to mention, I think this was posted to the webinar chat that Victor Murphy informed us, and I realized Pam and I had the hazards outlook maps up, I guess, that were updated yesterday morning. They were updated again in the afternoon and we didn't have those up. Apologize, but that area there of potential rapid onset drought does now extend further into the southeast through Georgia and into parts of North Florida. So just wanted to point everyone to that if you want to get the most up-to-date information on hazards that are maybe on the horizon. So anyway, this is Chris Furman again with NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'm stepping in, or going to try to step in for Meredith this month and facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have questions for any of the speakers, please put those in the question box. Before we turn to questions, to give you some time to add those, just a reminder that we'll be emailing a recap of this webinar along with the link to the recording within the next few days. So be on the lookout for that, and feel free to share across your networks. We have some really great webinars coming up. Next month, we'll be hearing about some innovative strategies to reduce the urban heat island. And in August, we'll be hearing about the new National Water Prediction Service. So be sure to register for those. And if you have suggestions for topics or speakers or anything that you feel can make these webinars better, please fill out the post-webinar survey. We do look at those very carefully every month, or you can contact Meredith at the email address there at the bottom of this slide. Okay, Eleanor, do we have any questions in the question box at this time?
We do. The Outer Banks are in the highest probability for hurricanes. Is the location of the Gulf Stream, which is warm, have any influence on this prediction? And I'm guessing this is probably for Matt, but I will let anybody who's interested take it.
I can take it. So the location of the Gulf Stream does not have any impact on this, on the seasonal outlook. It's a very small portion of the overall temperature pattern in the Atlantic. I will say though that the location of the Gulf Stream and or the loop current, the portion of that kind of on the west side that breaks off and goes into the Gulf of Mexico, can have huge implications on individual storms and their tracks. If they hit a warm portion of loop current, they can rapidly intensify, or if the storm is able to pull a lot of energy from the Gulf Stream, they can rapidly intensify on the East Coast. So you may have less time to prepare than you think. So preparing now, rather than trying to do everything in the last 2 or 3 days, take the time to do it now. Line up your documents, understand your risks, get a little bit of food, kind of get a plastic container, 20 liter plastic container, something like that. Throw your supplies in it, have it ready to grab, go to the car and evacuate if you need to. Things like that really help right now, because those storms, even the category 5s that have made landfall since 2016, almost all of them were tropical storms only 72 hours prior. So there's been a lot of intensification, 96 hours prior, excuse me. So you may think you have a 5 or 6 day window from the National Hurricane Center's forecast, but nature doesn't operate on our timelines and has been operating faster than our timelines recently.
Okay, that generated a couple of follow-ups. First, so can that Gulf offshoot supercharge a storm in the Gulf?
Yes, the loop current, if you get a warm loop that goes in the Gulf, not only is the Gulf already warm, but then it will make it warmer and give it more energy. And storms running into that can rapidly intensify more easily. That warm water, that loop of warm water moves under, if the storm moves over top of that, plus it's also a deeper pool of warm water. And the depth of the pool of warm water is very key. We refer to it as ocean heat content. When that is high, that is when the storm has the most potential to rapid intensify.
Okay, and then related to warning, generally speaking, will the new forecasting tool upgrades provide more advanced warning?
They will likely provide more accurate track and intensity forecasts. So that should translate into more accurate and earlier warnings. So likely, but then the updates that we're doing, the models that we're doing this year, that was the best model last year out through days 3 to 5, and it's going to be even better this year. So it should be. The way you'd likely see that manifest itself are over time, you will see smaller cone of uncertainty. That's really how it manifests itself. So it's more targeted warnings, maybe not earlier warnings, but just more targeted.
Okay, and then another one about Saharan dust and the impact of that. There's been recently been some evidence that Saharan dust will be spreading across the Atlantic and into the Gulf. Do you see this having an impact on the possible development of storms in the next few weeks?
Yes, this is the time of the year for Saharan dust outbreaks. They typically go late June, most of July into early August, and they kind of calm down after that as the West African monsoon has really kicked in. So for the next couple of weeks, I do see the potential for, if a disturbance runs into a pocket of dust that is particularly intense, it could impede the development of that storm. And we don't have anything right now that indicates tropical storm formation. Kind of after July 2nd, it seems to be a little bit quieter. So if we can get through the next week, then after that, we're potentially seeing some a little bit quieter period in the Atlantic, but it's going to ramp up in the Pacific. So we may have a bit of a respite now. So preparing now, take the time.
What factors influence East Coast hurricanes to move inland?
The wind patterns kind of off to the north and east of the storm. Is there a bigger high pressure, a bigger Bermuda high off to the north and east over the Atlantic that can drive the storms a little bit further west? The other aspect is if you get a late season cold front or a late season storm system moving from the northwest, like over the plains down towards the southeast, they kind of pick up one of those storms and bring it into the southeast rather than having it kind of move west across the Gulf towards Texas or Mexico.
Okay, and then this next one's about the Gulf Stream again, and if I misstate this question, I'm just going to ask this person to just restate it if I say this the wrong way. But is there a way to monitor those offshoots and see if they can you see whether a storm is going to pass over that warmer current, draw energy, and supercharge on NOAA, or are there other resources that you can monitor those storm tracks in that way?
Well, hurricanes.gov will have that, and that's the National Hurricane Center's website. That will have in the discussions there, the forecasters of the National Hurricane Center are looking at the loop current, and they are looking at will a storm impact that and interact with it, and that'll be mentioned in the discussions, advisories, and intensity forecasts. I don't know. Coast Watch, NOAA Coast Watch may have sea surface temperature and hurricane tracks over top of that. That'd be a resource we'd have to look up though. On does anybody have a track forecast and a predicted sea surface temperature just on the same website? I don't personally manage any website that does that.
Okay, and that is all that we have so far, but I have a question to give folks some time to think of some more. We've talked a little bit about how some flash drought conditions are emerging in the northern portion of the Southeast. And I'm wondering, how does a hurricane making landfall on a dry continent compared to one that's experiencing wet or normal conditions? How can that change kind of some of the conditions that happen upon landfall?
A hurricane making landfall on a place that's been very dry.
Yes, yeah.
Happens more often than you might think. It's a heck of a way to end a drought, but you end up with a lot of flash flooding, more than you would, you're more susceptible to flooding. If you had a decent drought and you've killed some of your vegetation, weakened their root structures even, made the top layer of soil quite dry and hard. A lot of parts of the Southeast are clay type soils in the top layer, and that gets really dry and really hard. That first bit of rain kind of bounces off of it and creates a lot of runoff very quickly. So you're much more susceptible to flash flooding in the first bands of the storm. And then you can have a lot of erosion and flooding after that. Not quite this, that would be a little bit more susceptible inland where you have that steeper terrain for the kind of mud slides and things like that. But the flash flooding, even in, so you have a big grassy area that you would think would kind of absorb some of your moisture next to a parking lot or something, it may not absorb as much moisture as you think, and may push moisture towards your parking lot in that case and towards your buildings or your houses.
This is Pam. Let me add to that. Hurricane rainfall is very hit or miss. And so if the hurricane comes over you, you'll get a lot. But if you're farther away, it could actually be drier because you'll be in the sinking air. We saw that with Hurricane Matthew along the East Coast a few years ago. And areas that had the Hurricane Matthew rain were just flooded out. But areas just farther to the west in Georgia and South Carolina got drier because of the lack of rainfall there. So the seasonal forecast is a little misleading because some areas are going to get more rain, but there may be some areas that are missed as well. So you really have to watch those forecasts to see where the rain is going to go.
Great, and I think the questions are slowing down, so we have a little bit of boat storage advice. Would you advise keeping a boat in Maryland this summer and fall, or should they move it to Florida?
I'm not sure what other considerations they have, such as their insurance policies. Would those allow that may actually up your costs dramatically? I know friends that have boats that can't go south during hurricane season, depending on the boat and the insurance. So maybe not make sense. So I don't know. There's too many other variables in that situation for me to say.
Great. Thanks. Well, I think that's all the questions that we've gotten so far. So Chris, I'll hand it back to you to wrap us up, unless we see another one come in.
Yeah, unless there's one that comes in here in the next few seconds. But of course, all of our contact info is going to be in the recap email. So if anyone does have follow-up questions, you can certainly contact us. All right. So again, thank you all for joining us this month, and we look forward to seeing everyone on a future webinar. So have a great rest of your day.